European Parliament came up in early January with its clear ideas. Here, always with a link towards potentially changing the treaties, and so-called agoras or youth conferences for the collection of opinions and in-depth reflections of European citizens. At the same time, we have on the table the Commission's communication on shaping the conference on the future of Europe, and since this Wednesday, the 24th of June, also a positioning of the Council, eventually. Here, however, we have a clear reference, clearly not to Article 48 of the TEU for very good reasons, and I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities during now the short presentations to come back to this. Overall, this panel should address the following questions. Which future for the Conference on the Future of Europe in times of COVID-19? What about the joint declarations of the three institutions, putting light on all open questions? Now that we have positions of all institutions, by when can we actually expect a joint approach? Can a two-year process with no clear outcome and direction really be afforded in these times of COVID-19? And last but not least, and that is probably the elephant in the room, and a very provocative maybe statement also vis-a-vis the European Parliament representative, Gabriele Bischoff, is it in the end just something we have to accept in times of crisis? It is the time again of the executive, of the European executive, and with this probably also predominantly the European Council. We have on our panel Katrin Aul, who will start. Everyone will have 5 minutes to present their statements. Next to Katrin Aul from the Institute for Advanced Studies, as I already said, we have then Gabi Bischoff being next in line, representing the European Parliament here, and more importantly, being one of the key drivers on this topic in the European Parliament. We then have Jim Close, who followed very closely the negotiations and now last Wednesday, the preparation and also the follow-up now during the German presidency, and Wolfgang Wessels, who is an expert, amongst others, obviously, with his most recent latest monography on the European Council. With this short introduction, I would hand over the floor to you, Katrin, 5 minutes for your statements. Happy to have you all on board and looking forward to a very interesting panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction and for inviting me to the panel. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to be one of those nightmare participants that doesn't respond directly to the questions that were put. I hope you'll allow me to sort of move away just slightly from the topics and speak on something that is definitely related, namely, and something that maybe has also fallen a bit into the background and is now in danger to be taken off the agenda of the Conference on the Future of Europe entirely, and that is institutional reform and democratic legitimacy. After the elections in 2019, you could hear the sighs of relief all over Europe. The Eurosceptic parties had been strengthened, but not as much as everyone had expected or had feared. Turnout had increased overall and in a majority of member states. And there seems to be somewhat some complacency when it comes to the democratic legitimacy in Europe, that things are now all in order and back on track. And I think that's not the case, and I think we shouldn't let these topics fall back into the background. I think it's a bit too early to celebrate. We don't yet have really in-depth analyses of the election, but the first analyses we have, for example, by the European Election Monitoring Center, show that the election was again characterized by a low-intensity campaign. In a majority of member states, it was barely perceptible, and the election was still main second-order, fought on domestic issues. What I see, however, as the worst outcome of the election is the almost casual abandonment of the so-called Spitzenkandidaten process. I'm aware that the Spitzenkandidaten model hardly has lived up to the expectations connected to it so far, despite all of the significant resources that were invested in the campaigns. But it was hailed as a democratic innovation intended to give European citizens an indirect say over the appointment of one of EU's top jobs. I think the damage that was done this last year will be rather difficult to recover from. And if something like a lead candidate model is to be saved, and I think it is still worth saving, I don't think it can be any longer at the disposal of political actors involved. But it must be based on a legal and binding formalization of the process. And that brings me sort of more directly or more closely to the topic of this panel, because I know, of course, also that there right now is very little possibility for an agreement at the EU level on institutional reform in general, and on whether, and if yes, how to embed the Spitzenkandidaten model anywhere in the treaties. But I think this is exactly where the Conference of the Future of Europe could be, or could have been, a very, very valuable opportunity to address this issue, but also to address other issues that are related to democratic innovation. For example, the introduction of transnational lists that failed for the last election. For example, improvements to the European Citizens Initiative, or improvements to the role of national parliaments in the EU. For me, there are two crucial questions here with regard to the conference. One, of course, is, and you've already mentioned that in your introductory statement, is how the agenda for this conference is set. Both the European Parliament and the Commission have proposed to put institutional reforms on the agenda for the conference, although the Commission was very, very careful in doing that. And for the conference to have a real impact here, the institutional reforms shouldn't be formally taken off the agenda. But unfortunately, and to be very honest, I find it incredibly disappointing that that seems to have happened now. The Council seems to have taken institutional reform formally off the agenda. I think in turn that this conference could actually be a real opportunity to tackle these democratic innovations and institutional reforms, because they could be based on a broad public debate, and on a debate that involves citizens who then have an actual say over their own democratic participation in the EU. On the other hand, I think that it will, the success of the conference will also very, very crucially depend on exactly how citizens and civil society are involved. We so far have very, very little information on this. There are some vague ideas, and I am personally definitely not an expert here, but those who are have already put forward quite a number of suggestions on how to organize the citizen involvement or civil society participation effectively. Around the discussions surrounding the conference and the organization, there seems to be at least one clear agreement, and one that I share, namely that maybe it would be a lost opportunity to draw on the same kinds of instruments that have been used in the past years. The EU institutions and the member states have invested quite heavily in citizen participation over the last years. For example, through a number of citizens' dialogues that have been organized by the European Commission, but also within and by the member states. For example, by massive online consultations that have taken place on both levels as well. And it's clear such instruments can without doubt foster mutual understandings, both among the citizens who participate, but also between citizens and decision makers. However, if we look at the actual outcomes of these exercises and on the impact they had, I think we need an improved approach. We need an improved approach that takes citizens' views actually into account and that actually transforms them into EU policymaking. So in other words, it's very, very nice that the EU tends to listen to its citizens, but it also should make sure that it actually hears them. And I would very, very much hope that the German presidency would use its time in office to work towards that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrin. And this is probably the right place then also to have these debates later on in the panels. So please do make use of the chat function. Manuel Müller is collecting the questions already right now. And I would hand over directly to Gabriele Bischoff, representing the European Parliament. I think she would be probably very much supportive of the idea involving citizens, but there are much concrete ideas also, right, of forms of how to actually involve them. Bischoff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And yes, I will definitely, it will be a good continuation of what Katrin Aul already referred to remember. Why did we decide to do such a conference? On one hand, it was one of the key promises of Commission President von der Leyen when she was candidate. And it was also a signal of the wish to repair the damage that was done with the Spitzenkandidat principle. And it was something the European Parliament for a long time already pushed for such a conference and already has done quite a work with proposals on institutional reforms here. I think it's also important to reflect that the lack of a capacity to act is also a driving motor for this conference in terms of if you look that the European Union was not able to provide sufficient solutions if you look at the issues of migration and asylum, of the regulation of the financial markets and others, and also that we realized that the world has changed tremendously since the Lisbon Treaty came into force in terms of internal challenges like growing inequalities, growing divergences between member states, the climate crisis, the project of the Green Deal, but also externally because the world changed with a few, just to mention China, the US, or Russia. So then we had the COVID pandemic, and it served as an excuse why we were not able to start the conference on the 9th of May because the Council could not agree. I wouldn't be sure if we wouldn't have COVID, if they would have agreed in time on a mandate, because we have seen that there were some profound problems to agree in the Council. When we look at COVID, I think it showed again, like in a magnifying glass, the problems, a lack of solidarity, really national reflexes to answer this crisis. I think one of the symbols for citizens for the positive impacts of European integration, free movement and open borders was attacked in a way that was unprecedented. So the opinion of most discussants is, okay, if we wouldn't have had the idea of a conference now with COVID, we would have done it. And what we can also see with the COVID crisis is, I mean, I refer to all the deficiencies, and this is reform out of weaknesses. But with the COVID crisis and the immediate reaction, the design of the recovery program, we also now see a different approach. Also, when we look at this federalist moment that came in with the new debates on the own resources, on more solidarity, borrowing money as the European Union, a lot of things that would not have been possible, I would say half a year before, were now possible under this crisis. And this could give also a positive impetus to this conference now. But if we look at the realities, and it was already mentioned, we now have 3 mandates, and we have, in some general lines, we can see similarities about the rough governance, to have an eminent leader, to have a sort of steering and everything. Also, roughly on the institutional panel, to have national parliaments, to have European Parliament, member states, and the Commission, Committee of Regions, the European Economic and Social Committee in there, and also about the timeline. The timeline is still that we haven't had a starting date, but we know already the timeline when to end, which will be in 2022. But I think it's worth really looking at the areas of major differences and where the negotiations will be very tough. And I will just refer to some. Indeed, as it said, the institutional matters there is a very different approach between the European Parliament and the Council. The Parliament wanted to review the current functioning of the EU, to work on the Spitzenkandidaten principle and transnational list, and we said in due time to 2024. I think this will be a key aspect. The Council doesn't even mention it anymore. We have major differences in the kind of involvement of citizens, because we saw the lack of the last debates on the future of Europe. This is why we came up with this model of randomly selected citizens by criteria to really reflect the debates and not have the ones that are already pro-European interested. And on the same time, also that we create a European public sphere. So we don't want to fall back again in an addition of different national debates, but to have this European agoras, thematic agoras, coming up with proposals, and have really a sort of a link between the debates in the institutional panel and the citizens agoras in a way that the citizens don't come up with proposals only, but also get a feedback what happens with their proposals in the end, and have here really links between the different panels. And that's the key difference. Is the Council's idea is a lot of independent discussions, and in the end they want to round up this with a report to the European Council. I think if you just do the whole initiative to have a report to the European Council, we could leave it. We could use the time better. We had that, remember, after the Juncker initiative, this report, nothing happened. So I think the negotiations have to be fast. We don't have another half year to do that if we want to start, and we need to start this conference during this year. And this means a speed up process of a sort of political agreement between the 3 presidents and a kind of memorandum of understandings in terms of governance, in terms of contents, and in terms of for what are we doing this initiative and what should be the outcome. And it's clear in the treaty, in the Council position, that it's not that the goal is not treaty changes, but for us, we always seen as a prelude to a normal process for changing the treaties. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bischoff, for your very informative input here on this panel. You keep on referring to the Council, so there is a need now to bring in Jim Close. Jim, I'm very happy to have you on the panel as well. Again, to the audience, please do start asking questions. Manuel Müller from the EEP is collecting them. And now I see Jim got his last sip of coffee and is ready now to take over. Jim, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. I will start from the title, which is for me a bit strange. It seems to me that in times of real crisis, you not focus primarily on institutional reforms, which take a long time. You focus on the capacity of the existing institutions to deliver. Now, in our system, we have a problem because we don't have a clear executive in the union. It's not the Commission. They have some executive powers. To some extent, there is a collective governance by the European Council, but they have no executive powers. Most of the executive power is national. That means, of course, that at our level in the EU, we have to be extremely innovative. We have to take into account the situation of national governance. I heard a lot about the Spitzenkandidat and all of these ideas. The Council had never accepted this principle as such, and not because of a lack of democracy, simply because they see democracy slightly different. Each crisis, that's my second point, leads naturally to a reflection on working methods and on the adequacy of our instruments. This happened with the subprime crisis some years ago, where we ended up with the Fiscal Compact Treaty, which was an intergovernmental treaty because the British blocked the reform of the EU treaty, but it happened because it was deemed necessary to increase a certain number of fiscal controls. So if there is a need, then the Council is not necessarily against treaty change, but we do not like to start from there. This brings me to the conference on the future of Europe. The idea was born in a different context, and I actually do not think that the Council would not have come forward with a proposal without the COVID crisis. We were actually very close. But it is true that the crisis is an additional argument for this conference. So there is a willingness on the part of the Council to engage, and Coreper this week agreed on a mandate, so to have talks with the Parliament and the Commission. Now, the text does not explicitly exclude treaty change, but it is pretty clear that it's not starting with treaty change. It says the Union framework offers potential to allow challenges to be addressed in an effective manner. And to make it even more explicit, the final sentence is the conference does not fall within the scope of Article 48 of the treaty. I personally tend to think that the Council is wise. The last thing we need now is an ideological debate about institutions and their respective powers. That would be putting the cart before the horse. Now, if the discussions reveal a pressing need to adapt the treaty, well, we have ways of changing the treaty according to the treaty itself, and it can of course be looked at. But there is a very clear wish on the part of the Council to put policy first. We want an inclusive platform with a key role for citizens to discuss societal challenges. And this, in the context of COVID, is of course extremely important because there are many societal challenges. We want to look at values. We want to look at the international role of the EU. Organization. There are several principles for the Council. The first one is equality between the institutions. The second one is the respect of the various prerogatives of the institutions. The third one is to avoid a lot of bureaucracy. And the fourth one is to find an effective involvement of citizens. And there, I listened to what Gabi said. Obviously, we will have to talk more in detail about all this. The participation should be as wide as possible with governments, national parliaments, EU Parliament, of course, social partners, citizens. The idea for the Council is that there should be an eminent personality to chair this, who would act independently and as a single chair. The idea is to start with a kick-off conference, probably in Brussels, but that's not decided yet. There will be midterm conferences and the final one, and of course, there will be a lot of specific conferences to be looked at. The outcome, as Gabi said, will be reflected in a report to the European Council. I think that's not a bad idea because in our system, it's the European Council which fixes the broad orientations of the EU. So it depends very much what's in the report. If we manage to get the citizens to participate and to come up with brilliant ideas, I think it is good to submit that to the European Council. Now, as I said before, we now have a mandate. It is only a Council mandate. The Commission and the Parliament have their own positions, and we will have to sit together and agree on a joint mandate and a joint declaration, and I think it will be possible to do so. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jim, for your input here. And in the end, I mean, as Gabriel Bischoff also pointed out, there is a timeline, at least there is the end time fixed, and it might be in 2022 during a French presidency, maybe the right timing then to conclude with the announcement of a new convention following Article 48. Who knows? Now, taking up from here, we keep on referring now to the importance of the European Council, and there is no one else better equipped for this, having done research on this, than Wolfgang Wessels. Wolfgang, you also have 5 minutes for your key inputs. The floor is yours. You would need to put on your mic. Yes. Okay.
Because I was put aside. Okay. For TEPSA, we have the AAA approach. That means analysis, assessment, and advice for action. What is the analysis? I think the starting point is that the European Council is the constitutional architect. It was when it was not even mentioned in the treaty. It's now even more, because now it's clear, if you look at Article 48, in both procedures, it's the European Council who takes, let's say, the leading role and has to take the final decision. So the European Council, I think, is a major part to look at and to analyze it. And of course, it's not a unique institution in the sense that they all have the same opinions. In this procedure and for the analysis, we should look at some of the experiences. I don't go into detail, but I just would like to draw your attention to the Laken Declaration, which the European Council put forward. And it's still a very progressive document by trying to find crucial issues and institutional matters for the future of then, before the Big Bang enlargement. And they created also the convention, which was not yet in the treaty at that time. So they had, let's say, I would say, a rather progressive, dynamic approach, which, by the way, was the follow-up to the Nice IGC, which was terrible for them because it took 3 days and 2 nights to find some small changes in the treaty. So the European Council is there. Second point, which I would like to stress, is we had in the analysis, we can make assessment, a lot of involvement. Starting, by the way, from the Spinelli draft. Spinelli tried to involve national parliaments and public opinion. We had the same with the Constitution Convention. And there were all the same institutions involved, like now are planned in the Constitution. Rather, we need really a forceful person at the top. I mean, it was at that time Giscard and a presidium to make it. And you have to look how this can work, let's say, to put things together. But at the same time, I remember, I think political scientists all over Europe had half a day to debate with the members of the convention, which of course was totally inadequate and not appropriate from our point of view. But let's say that was what about subjects, Spitzenkandidat? I have a clear analysis on this, an assessment. It failed because the political parties were not able to implement it. It was not the European Council. It was the parties who draw candidates which were not popular. I mean, in France, the European People's Party got 9%. The Socialists got 5%. Would you claim that the French voted for one of them? Is this legitimate to have somebody elected who doesn't get any vote in major countries? And France is not the only exception. So I think that's a major issue. And perhaps there, the transnationalist, as Macron proposed, might be a good step forward. And I think that's a good way. And by the way, European Council could be institutionalizing it. That's in the treaty. You don't need a treaty change for that. Together with the parliament, of course. And as I remember well, the European Parliament didn't want to have transnationalists. And that's an issue. So I think that would be a point of assessment. Where are the failures to mobilize civil societies? And it's not just these people in the governments. They are slightly worried that they might be overrun, but it's quite a lot of political parties, groups. And if I listen that there should be randomly selected persons, I mean, as a social scientist, I'm quite afraid if you look for 500 million citizens, how you can have a randomly selected good presentation, how this might work. Perhaps some more people or other people who are more involved in the methodology might help us. But if there is one person from, let's say, Ireland in that, the Irish won't be very much convinced of, let's say, his or her positions. That was, by the way, the same with the Constitutional Convention, that some people from the Constitutional Convention in France argued against the Constitutional Treaty. So let's say I'm quite worried how this might really work in terms of accepted legitimacy, not in formal terms. Last point, advice for action. I think we should try to start the debate. I'm all for that. And some of the procedures are well done. I have a very clear point, and that's for our member of the European Parliament. I mean, the European Parliament could at the end make a proposal to start an intergovernmental conference. That's in the treaty. Nobody can prevent the European Parliament to make that initiative. Of course, if the European Council, by the way, by simple majority, would take that up to have a conference, I don't know. But let's say that would be a very clear focus. The European Parliament is the addressee of the members or of the citizens of this European Union. So perhaps we should analyze more what are the optimal conditions for this conference and what could be an outcome in the sense of a follow-up. Normally we would expect whatever the mandate is now, there will be a dynamic in this. And one of the dynamic, last point, for having the European Council taking serious steps, institutional reforms were mostly linked very clearly with political packages. So let's say the Maastricht Treaty was linked, the institutional reforms there, European Central Bank was having a monetary union. So the Nice Treaty had major problems because it was just about institutional and meant zero-sum games in this sense. So let's say my point would be this conference, and we should not just look for institutional reforms, but what could be really the vision for this Europe, this European Union after the crisis we had. Let me make a final assessment because I think that's very important for legitimacy. As a proposal which is now put forward, both by the Franco-German tandem as by von der Leyen, is, I think, already a step in treaty adaptation, namely to put the reconstruction fund into the normal community budgetary procedure. I think that's a major advantage and a major progress, not to have Corona bonds who are decided by whoever outside any influence, and that now the European Parliament has a major say. It's a co-decision maker. It has a veto power. So I think this was, in my point of view, a very good way within the institutional setup to do things which I think increase legitimacy and I hope also efficiency. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I think for all panelists already, I think you made cross-references very successfully. So there are already a couple of questions for all of you that have been piling up. But in the meantime, there are probably also other questions from the audience. So let me switch now to Manuel Müller, who is one of the senior scientists at the EEP. And also the Europäische Föderalist, the blogger you probably all are very much aware of. Manuel, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, we are still welcoming question. For the moment, there has been only one question by Peter Christian Müller-Graf to Katrin Aul, and he has asked, in your opinion, who is to blame for the failure of the Spitzenkandidaten model in 2019?
So this is probably a good question that was already partly addressed by Wolfgang. So he already gave his interpretation of why the Spitzenkandidaten process failed. That's a direct question to Katrin as well. So please just put it on your list, Katrin, because I would see and encourage everyone who would like to have a question, raise a question, to do this now, to indicate that you want to ask a question because of the timing. I would then give the floor to Katrin, and following the order of the panelists, to give maybe short statements to a couple of things that might have come up through after listening the panel. Katrin, would you give it a first attempt, short and crisp if possible? Your mic, please. Your mic. Sorry.
Thank you. It's always so odd when you sort of go and then you have to start again. Who messed it up? I think that was a wonderful joint effort. I'm not pointing fingers at sort of one particular group or political actor. It is certainly, I put blame with the political groups in the European Parliament who for political reasons, but also for personal reasons, were not able to firmly stand behind the process and behind the candidate that the process had produced. But I also don't agree with Wolfgang on the fact that the European Council is blameless here, because the European Council has always been rather negative about the Spitzenkandidaten model. It has tolerated it, and sort of it didn't like the revolution of the European Parliament, and when it had the chance, it started the counter-revolution. You can also see this in the fact that the European Council was way better prepared than it was last time, and had meetings scheduled on discussions for the appointment of the European Commission President. So yeah, a very good joint effort in messing this up.
Katrin, could I, thank you very much. Could I, to make it a little bit more interactive and lively and without now following the order, I would maybe ask Jim to jump in, because I'm sure that he has a very, a clear interpretation of who is to blame with regard to the Spitzenkandidaten process. Jim, would you like to take the floor? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Michael. For me, the question is not very well posed. The blame, it looks as though Spitzenkandidaten is something intrinsically good, and if you disagree with it, you are not democratically legitimate. Let me say a few things. First, I rather tend to agree with Volker. Institutions are not ends in themselves. They are there to do policy. So we should, in a crisis, we have a mega crisis. How would you explain to citizens that the first thing the EU does in a debate about the future of Europe is to say, oh, we have to sort out the power relationship between the Council and the Parliament and the Commission? I think some people speak for the citizens. I have very much doubt that the citizens would like us to do it. Let me say a word on the Spitzenkandidaten. The Spitzenkandidaten failed because the way it was done and embedded into a different system was an artificial construction. That's why it failed. It completely neglected the fact that in the Union we have a double legitimacy, and both legitimacies are democratic. We have a directly elected parliament by all the citizens, it's great, but we also have the Council and the European Council, where you have representatives of member countries, all of them democratically appointed, and having national governments. It's a double legitimacy. And the fact to imply that the European Council did something bad because it disagreed with the EP's interpretation on the Spitzenkandidaten is simply not fair, and it simply doesn't work. My last remark, and I make a very personal remark, I'm a Luxembourg citizen, so I vote in Luxembourg. I vote in Luxembourg for the European elections. Now, I'll be honest with you. When I vote in Luxembourg for the European elections, I vote for a Luxembourg politician who I think represents my country best in the European Parliament. I do not vote for the President of the Commission because I have absolutely no impact on the nomination of that candidate. I can vote for a certain party in Luxembourg, but completely disagree with the Spitzenkandidaten put forward. And so I do not accept that it's not democratic. Final remark, the Commission is put forward, is nominated according to a very complicated but a very democratic system. Candidates put forward by national governments on the basis of majorities. The Council endorses. The Parliament has to give a final vote. You cannot be much more democratic than that. Thank you.
Okay, you see the discussion is getting a little bit heated and very personal. That's very, very good. In the meantime, we also get more questions. Manuel, what about the questions? Maybe we add just a couple of them. Yes.
Well, there is a new question by Marco Schwarz from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Brussels about the timeline of the Conference on the Future of Europe. If it starts only this year or at the end of this year, when will it end? Will it be the full 2 years, or will it end in early 2022? Because that would make a difference. And the question is directed to anybody in
yes,
special.
Excellent. Thank you, Manuel, because I think that helps us also to bring back the discussion to the Conference on the Future of Europe. And well, Spitzenkandidat may be super interesting and maybe also part of it, but probably not the most important aspect. So I would love to invite Gabriele Bischoff to come back to you, because you were elaborating on the timeline. And there were a lot of outstanding questions from the panelists. So I would love to give you the floor for a couple of minutes and to see whether there will be further questions from the audience in between. Thank you.
Thank you very much, but allow me to, at least with reference to the conference, draw one of the lessons learned from the Spitzenkandidaten process, the one example where it worked and the one where it failed. If you look at this in a moment where the representatives of the European Commission and Parliament were in line, they were successful. In the moment where you had divisions here, it was possible for the Council to move ahead, and this should be something we should remember for the negotiation process on the end design of this conference. And I think it's interesting to look at the different positions of the three institutions in certain areas, and then you can already anticipate in which direction it might go. But coming back to the timetable, indeed,
Mrs. Bischoff, we have another question which also I think would also be nice if you could address it. So I would invite Manuel to maybe add the question to you so that you can combine this in your question.
Yes,
okay?
Because in a way it's it's interrelated. Katrin Böttger from Institut für Europäische Politik is asking what role do you see for civil society in the Conference on the Future of Europe? And then if there's civil society participation, should the conference start virtually because of COVID-19, or should it rather be postponed until personal meetings are possible again?
Yeah, that relates very well to the question on the time frame. Indeed, we couldn't start on the 9th of May. We now, it's the end of June where we have the 3 mandates, and I think the 3 presidents will have to speed up in their talks on achieving a political agreement. And then there we will have another phase, most probably also where more in detail the architecture of this conference will be agreed, and we will have a kind of written result, a memorandum of understanding, or however you will call it. It will be most probably not be a formal interinstitutional agreement because of the time frame to start. The Parliament, in the new resolution that came out in the last plenary, where we wanted again to give a signal to the Council to speed up now, but also to address that we should start in autumn and then take the 2 years. So it will also depend on when the starting conference will take place, and you see the 2 years, if it will be under the French presidency as Macron wishes, or it will be later in 2022. It is agreed that it will last for 2 years. And I think also that with the COVID crisis, we have to adapt. We can see already that the German presidency postponed all conferences until October. So the estimation at the moment is that after that, with certain preconditions to take, even conferences and meetings might be possible again. But I think also that in a preparatory phase, it could be good to have a combination on one hand of digital sort of preparatory work and meetings and conferences, and then later on meetings at different locations, be it Brussels, Strasbourg, or hopefully also a lot in member states that have the presidency or others, because I think it would not be a good signal to just limit it to Brussels and Strasbourg. And the role of civil society, in the ideas of and the concept of the parliament, we have this 7 or 8 citizens agora with a couple of 100 people. So we have to see if with COVID there is a need with the security obligations we have, where and how to do it, but also having the institutional panel where we have also representatives like the Economic and Social Committee. They will be also probably be invited into the steering committee, and then having a lot of debates on national and European level with civil society, with politicians in a sort of concentric circles here, and to find a way, as it was said, we now have improved capacities for consultation with digital means, and to find a way how this will then feed back into the work of the institutional panel and into the final report or the final result of this conference.
Okay, thank you very much for this for your first reactions to some of the questions that were raised by the audience, but also by the panelists in particular. Now let me see and move to Manuel, whether there are any other questions which you would be able to chip in.
There are no more questions at the moment, and looking at the time, I think yes. that isn't so bad.
Okay, good, very good. Well, then obviously, Wolfgang, in case you would like to pick up on a couple of issues, it would be now your floor. Please.
Yeah, I would like first of all to raise a question: what is the civil society? I mean, whatever we see from sociologists, we see that what we thought in the 50s, 60s, and perhaps to the middle of the 80s, certain structures, trade unions, churches, other groupings, we are less and less, let's say in this sense, there's less and less the civil society. There's a lot of groups, a lot of citizens. We are seeing in the social media that they're very interested and active in different ways. Sometimes we think that this is not the appropriate way, but still, I think there's a lot of debate and possible. But we should be clear also in terms of legitimation, who is representing. And I'm sorry if I say, if the Economic and Social Committee or the Regional Committee is involved, who do they represent? I don't know who represents my land, North Rhine-Westphalia, in the Regional Committee. He's not known, or she's not known, I don't even know who is it. And in the Economic and Social Committee is the same. They are not the leading figures of trade unions who travel to Brussels, but those who have time, who are perhaps experts. I don't argue against these committees, but I just argue, are they legitimate? I wonder. I mean, European Parliament is legitimate. I think that's a clear point. And who else? And I only can recommend to look more how the Constitutional Convention worked. And there are a couple of people also linked with TEPSA, Andrew Duff, for example, who can tell you a lot of things who worked. And one of the interesting points there was no working group on institutions. I think Giscard tried to prevent that. I don't know why exactly, but it only indicates how to manage that. So have an analysis assessment of how this worked, how the, let's say, Spitzenkandidaten worked or didn't work. And I agree, Katrin, I was a little bit harsh that it's only the political parties who were failing that, both in the campaign. Clearly, there are very few people who realized that they were Spitzenkandidate in the election. And Jim mentioned his own private experience. I have others that nobody, when I talked about the European election in my town, nobody asked for the Spitzenkandidat. But that can be changed. The second, of course, was a weakness in the European Parliament itself, which then the head of state and government could use. So we have to draw also experience from that. And I totally agree with Jim that we should be careful of not saying because the Spitzenkandidat didn't work, there's a lack of legitimacy. That I would not share. I think the dual legitimacy is a big advantage. And what we always see, it's a battle between the European Council and European Parliament. Well, go ahead also as European Parliament for that. And we will see that in the reconstruction fund and the multi-annual financial framework. I think it would be very important that the Parliament shows what might be in interest, what they represent as parties and interests. So I'm very much for this balance of power. And we have one big country in the world which exists from these constitutional battles for centuries, that's the United States. They don't have a clear government, and Mr. Trump realizes that each day that he has limits in doing what he wants to do. But that's, of course, another issue. So I think we need to live with this constitutional battle, and it should be stronger on the European Parliament side. I totally agree with that. But we should be aware that also the members of the European Council have legitimacy and, of course, need to react to people's worries. And they represent, if you look for the Council, for the budget of the EU, they are there to, let's say, defend the budget to the citizens, because the European Parliament doesn't have any right to raise taxes. That would be, for example, a very good issue. Should the European Parliament have the right to raise taxes, and then the Parliament would not just be looking for expenditures, but need also to defend income. I think that would be a very good step. Okay, thank you.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much. I mean, from the beginning, ladies and gentlemen, this panel promised to be exciting, thought-provoking. We had heated debates on basically the institutional reform of times in times of crisis management. I think a lot of open questions. We couldn't give a lot of answers, but I think that's the best you can take out of such a panel, because it gives us all a lot of food for thought. Together with Manuel Müller, we knew that we would not be able to give you all the answers right away. But I think with the excellent composition of this panel, as organized by the Institute für Europäische Politik, the organizers of this PPC, Katrin Aul, with Gabi Bischoff, with Jim Close and Wolfgang Westels, I think we got a very good idea, a very up-to-date idea of the topical issues on the agenda, specifically related to the conference on the future of the European Union. And with this, it is 12:30. The organizers will be delighted that we can be handing over now to Beck. Back to then the final statements of the chairwoman of TEPSA, Lucia Mocca, and Jim Close. I'm very much looking forward to this. I thank all of you, the panelists, full-heartedly. Manuel, for your support until the very end. And with this, have a good rest of the PPC. Thank you very much.